All right. Did everyone else hear that say recording in progress?
Yep.
Yes.
All right.
Got it.
If you don't hear that at any of these sessions, do what Alan did and tell me to start recording. So we'll make sure it's recorded for anyone else. So anyway, so this is the first of our series, and you can see I got a logo. I made this logo, Windermere University. Not that has to be our official logo or anything like that, but I thought I'd be official for this. So so we have the first of these classes. If you have not seen the sermon for this past Sunday, that's fine, but that sermon provides a base for what we're going to be doing today. So if you have not seen the sermon, you're probably wondering through 90% of this Bible study tonight what this has to do with Christmas. If you saw the sermon, then you know what it has to do with Christmas. But maybe the last 5 minutes we'll talk about the connection to Christmas, but we already should, if you've seen the sermon, you should already know the connection of what this has to do with Christmas. What we're going to be doing in this Bible study tonight and other nights is giving more foundational knowledge. So it's not just going to be your surface Bible study where Jesus did this or Jesus did that. We're going to be learning some fundamental knowledge that then can be applied to many things. In this Christmas standpoint, we'll be applying it to Christmas, of course. But now that you'll have this foundational knowledge, there might be other sermons down the road or other Bible studies down the road that this fundamental knowledge will build onto, if that makes sense. So when we're talking about Windermere University, we're doing this like a university. We're giving you some foundational knowledge. And then with this foundational knowledge, you can use that knowledge to then begin to think on your own and be able to put puzzle pieces together that you've never been able to put together because you never really had the foundational knowledge. Is there anyone here who really had an understanding of Gnosticism before I started talking about it at all? Yeah, so that's a foundational knowledge because there's a lot, and you'll see tonight, there's a lot of Christianity, not just Christmas time, but there's a lot of Christianity that connects to that concept of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is, and we'll learn about it, so if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. Gnosticism is considered a heretical Christian view, not an Orthodox view, it's a non-correct view of Christianity is how it's viewed. It was cast aside in the early church, okay? Hence what we talked about in the sermon. We want the human Christ, not just the divine Christ. So they cast aside the Gnostic Christianity. But most of the Bibles, or most of the Gospels that we have uncovered, because there's more Gospels than what's in the Bible, most of the Gospels we've uncovered are Gnostic Gospels. It was a big part of early Christianity. And that Gnosticism, even though it was cast aside, it was so much a part of Christianity, it's made it into our Christian theology today. It made it into the Bible today, and we don't even notice it. And we'll talk about that as we get into it. So today's topic is going to be primarily about Gnosticism. It is going to relate to Christmas because Christmas is a response to Gnosticism, but there's going to be a lot within Christianity that this is good foundational knowledge as we talk about other stuff. So we're gonna get into. I'm going to share my screen so I can do my PowerPoint presentation. Let's get into it here. Let's share. Get down here. Okay, can you guys see the screen?
Mm-mm.
No.
No. You cannot see my screen.
No.
No.
I can
Sure,
see
sure,
Connie.
sure,
She
sure.
looks great.
How about now?
Yes.
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 Okay. Gnosticism. Okay. So the word Gnostic means secret knowledge. Okay, that's all Gnosticism is secret knowledge. And by the way, as we go through this PowerPoint and all of my PowerPoints for this lecture and other lectures, for many of you who don't know this already, I teach at the university level, have been teaching for about 10 years. And this year, so far, I'm still teaching online. When I transferred over, I still have a couple of online classes that I'm doing currently. Anyways, this is not a direct lecture from the class, because the class goes different directions, but I have refashioned the information into a Bible study, if you will. But it's the same stuff I'm teaching to the kids, just packaged differently. But I say that also that as I go through slides, and you're going to be going, that's an interesting slide. This is made for 18 and 19-year-old kids, and I got to grab their attention. So I have 19 and 18-year-old appropriate slides. And I just kept them in here because I figured if my 18 and 19-year-old kids are mature enough to handle the slides, so are you. But they're just attention-grabbing slides. You'll see them when they come up. But anyways, we're talking about Gnosticism. Now let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we already talked about the word gnosis means secret knowledge. It's a spiritual knowledge, not an intellectual knowledge. So it's not about being able to do high-powered science. It's a secret spiritual knowledge. So it's a secret, and it's some spiritual knowledge that's being conveyed. That's what the Gnosticism is. And it is that knowledge that is going to redeem us. Okay, again, this is not current Christianity. This is Gnostic Christianity. So once we get this secret knowledge, that's what's going to give us salvation. That's what's going to get us into heaven. That's what's going to enter us into the spiritual world, is that secret knowledge. Again, that's what Gnosticism is. I'm separating that from current Christianity. That's not current Christianity, but that's Gnosticism. But we're going to see the Gnostic influence on the current Christianity. Another definition with Gnosticism is it's dualistic. There are two different ways of looking at it. There's the material world and the spiritual world. There's this understanding that earth is bad and heaven is good. The body is bad, the spirit is good. There's light and darkness in that conversation. Light is good, darkness is bad. Basically, anything material, anything earthly, our body, this computer in front of me, anything that's material in the earthly world is bad. The pure spiritual world is good. So it's very dualistic and a strong understanding of what is good and what is bad. Switch over here. So in Gnosticism, there are two gods, okay? And they are two gods. There is the good God of the spiritual realm, and there is the bad God of the material world. So it's a strict division. If all material is bad, then the good God can't be in charge of the bad. So there must be a bad God in charge of the bad material world, and the good God is in charge of the spiritual world. So there are two gods in this system. Here's where we start to find Gnosticism in the Bible in ways that you probably never thought of it before. So you've heard about the temptation of Christ. The way you heard about it probably didn't happen exactly how it's pictured on the screen. But the temptation of Christ, one of the temptations is that the devil offers Jesus the world. If you will bow down and worship me, I will give you the world. I will give you all the kingdoms that you see. Well, how can the devil offer Jesus the world? Because in Christianity, we would think that God has dominion over everything. So if God already owns the world, if God already created the world, if God's already in charge of the world, then what is the devil offering him? And if Jesus or God already owns the world, then there's no temptation that ever happened, because how can you be tempted by being offered something that you already have? So this is an understanding that the evil God has the material world, and the good God does not have the material world, but the evil God is offering to give the material world to Jesus in a temptation. So that's a Gnostic view. We don't see it that way, but when you think about it, you know, how could the devil tempt him unless Jesus did not have control over the world? And if we Christians want to say, well, Jesus did have control over the world, or God the Father had control over the world, then it wasn't a temptation, because you can't be tempted by something you already have. But the early people would have seen this in a Gnostic understanding. Here's some more in the Bible. I'll read this verse. This comes from 2 Corinthians. And listen closely for the Gnosticism. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbeliever to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, let the light shine out of the darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now that we had a little background knowledge on what Gnosticism is, now we can see Gnosticism in this. There's a lot of talk about light and dark. There's talk about the light of knowledge. But the more shocking thing is right here in the Bible, it talks about two gods. It talks about the God, lowercase g, up in verse 4. And it talks about the capital G God. So there's the God of this world. So that is the God of the material world. And then there's the God of the heavens and the spiritual realm. So this is Gnosticism and two gods being talked about in the Bible. We know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. Again, Gnosticism. There's the good God. Now, they're not calling the evil one a god in this one, but they are saying that the world is in the power of the evil one, because everything earthly and material is of the evil one. John 12, 31 to 36. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. So again, talking about the ruler of this world, and the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all the people to myself. And he said this to indicate the kind of death he was going to die. The crowd answered, we have heard from the laws of the Messiah remains forever. How can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? It just goes on and on. But the main part is the top part with the now the judgment of the world. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world to be driven out. Just showing who is in charge of this world. Get my cursor going here. Okay. This is partly what we talked about in the sermon. Gnosticism, Gnostic Christians believe that Jesus was pure spirit with no bodily form. If everything material, including the bodily form, is evil, then there's no way that Jesus could have had a bodily form, because then that means that there was a part of Jesus that was evil. So there is no bodily form for Jesus. Again, that's why we got the response of the birth narrative in Luke and Matthew for Christmas, to show that he was born into the world, that he actually had a body, that he's a real human being. That's that's how we get the bodily form. But for Gnostics, no body. Now, if it's no body, how his disciples were with him? People said that they saw him. He taught people. So what's going on with that? So here's two explanations. Gnosticism is split up into two camps. The first camp is the Docetic Christology, and Jesus was not really flesh and blood, but the appearance was an illusion. So that's why I kind of have our little Star Wars trilogy guys up here, that the appearance of Jesus was an illusion. It wasn't really a body. We were just made to think that we were seeing a body. It was an illusion that was being cast. So that's Docetic Christology. There's also a separationist Christology, and I kind of call this the invasion of the body snatchers theology. And in this Gnostic Christology, Jesus inhabited a human on earth. So there was poor Frank is walking to market, and then all of a sudden one day Jesus comes down and enters him, and now he's Jesus for the next couple of years, while Jesus is hanging out teaching people. So it wasn't really Jesus' body. Jesus just entered someone else and was borrowing someone else's body for a while. So that was separation. So there's two different Christologies that you see there, but that's how people tried to explain how we saw an earthly body. So we talked about this before. So Gnostic salvation, a person attains salvation by learning secret knowledge of their spiritual essence. So in this secret knowledge, it was something that was passed on. So you could only learn the secret knowledge by someone who had the secret knowledge. Jesus had the secret knowledge. And then when you read each of the Gnostic Gospels, each of the Gnostic Gospels followed a different disciple. And sometimes that disciple was Judas Iscariot, who crucified Jesus or handed him over to be crucified. That Judas was the greatest disciple there ever was. And other ones had other disciples that were their greatest disciple. But in every one of those Gospels, that particular disciple was understood of having the secret knowledge. The other disciples didn't get it, but the disciple of my book gets it, and so that's their secret knowledge. Now, why Judas Iscariot? How did he get a following? He's the one who handed Jesus over to be crucified. That's because, according to that gospel, Judas Iscariot was the only one who really understood Jesus. Judas Iscariot was the only one who really understood the gnosis, the secret knowledge. He's the only one who really understood the plan. Jesus came to earth to teach us, but then Jesus needed to be liberated from this body. So the crucifixion was a gift. It was part of the plan of how to liberate the spiritual Jesus from the body that he was trapped in. So Judas was doing a good thing as part of the plan to liberate Jesus from this body. That's the Gospel of Judas. But each one of the Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, would talk about their disciple having the secret knowledge, and then they're passing that secret knowledge on to the next group of people. And again, kind of what we were talking about with Jesus, this goes for everyone. We are all a spiritual being. This is Gnosticism. We are all a spiritual being, a spiritual essence, and we are trapped in the evil body. And then once we attain this secret knowledge, once we understand spiritually, we will be liberated from our body. And that's when we'll go up and live in the spiritual realm. That is what Gnosticism believes. But we can see some overlay within the Bible with all of this Gnosticism. I'm going to pull out just some random verses. The verse on top in black is from the Gospel of Thomas. So, Bo, I know you're on here. You love the Gospel of Thomas. These are some little bones from the Gospel of Thomas here. So the one on top is the Gospel of Thomas. The one below is from a biblical gospel. So And the Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic gospel. If a blind person leads a blind person, both of them will fall into a hole. Matthew, leave them, they are blind guides. If the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a pit. Again, you got to be following someone who has the spiritual knowledge. Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic gospel, Jesus said, know what is in front of your face and what is hidden from you. Remember, the secret knowledge is hidden from you will be disclosed to you. For there is nothing hidden that won't be revealed. Luke, for there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Jesus said, one who seeks will find, one who seeks will find, and for one who knocks, it will be opened. And Luke, for everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks will find, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. And we Christians take this in another way, but the Gnostics would take this in the seeking the spiritual knowledge, the seeking the understanding. Jesus said those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will rule over all. Matthew, ask and you shall receive, search and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. So they're similar statements. A person attains salvation by learning secret knowledge of their spiritual essence. And again, once we learn the secret knowledge, then we can be liberated from our bodies. So now we go to John 8:32, and it says straight out, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now that's a verse everyone's heard before, I'm sure. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But I bet you we never thought about it in a spiritual gnosis type of a thing. What does it mean to know the truth? What is the truth? And how will the truth set us free? We Christians kind of package that as just like, oh, well, the truth is another name for Jesus or something. You know, we kind of put some other overlay on it. But if we're going to take it for face value of the word truth, that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Okay, now here's a fun one that we're going to get into here. This is Gnosticism that we've all seen every day and never even realized it. So this I'm going to ask for class participation. So here we go. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay. So that's a phrase everyone on the Zoom chat, I am confident can quote that verse blindfolded. We hear that all the time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Now here's a question. What is the Word? Anyone?
The word God.
I'm
word
assuming
God?
Jesus.
Assuming Jesus?
Yeah.
And see that's obviously how Christians take it. So the answers I often get in my class is they'll say Jesus, they'll say the Bible, Christian scripture, the New Testament. They'll try to package it in that way. Here's a couple of things. Well, if it was Jesus, why don't you just say Jesus? In the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. Why wouldn't you just say Jesus? Why are we saying Word? And why the word Word? You know, Word is a collection of letters. You know, what do we mean Word? We just say Word as if we know what it means, but no Christian knows what it means.
It's,
Is someone have an answer?
I don't
Somebody
know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, but in the verse here, it says Word was God.
Okay, yeah, the Word was
So you're
God.
saying, what is the Word? So the Word was God.
Yeah, but
Is the way I'm reading it.
yeah, it does say the Word was God. But what is the word that was God? So we'll do this another way. Well,
Okay.
we got other slides here. So obviously I'm kind of setting up the chessboard here. So we're reading this in English. Okay. This was not written in English. This was written in Greek. Does anyone know what the Greek word that would be used in this verse is?
The logos.
Logos. In the beginning was the Logos.
Hmm.
And the Logos was with God. And the Logos was God. Now we have to define the word Logos. Spoiler alert, word is not really a good translation for Logos. Okay? But we don't want the good translation, because the good translation will mess with our Christian theology. So we put this weird, ambiguous word, and we kind of morph the understanding of Logos. So this is the Gospel of John, which, by the way, does not have a birth narrative. Even though that it was written after Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of John just begins with Jesus. No birth narrative. And begins with this talk about the Logos in the beginning. So what is the Logos? Again, John is writing this roughly 95 CE. So roughly 95 years after the birth of Jesus, depending on how you're dating the birth of Jesus. So this is nearly a century later, okay, that John is writing this. Who is John? John is a pagan convert to Christianity who lives in the Greek world, who understands the Greek world, and who speaks Greek, okay? Now, who is John preaching to? John is preaching to pagans who he's trying to convert to Christianity. Specifically, and by the way, pagan is a blanket term for anyone who's not a monotheistic Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, is the blanket terminology for pagan. It's not a specific religion of paganism. So John is trying to convert these pagan Greeks into Christianity, and he's speaking Greek, and he's choosing to use the word Logos. And he's saying, again, I'll repeat, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was God, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Logos in Greek philosophy means divine reason. It's the divine reason that's controlling the principle of the universe. Logos in Gnosticism is a divine being known as wisdom or Sophia. Now, I don't know if any of you knew there was a brief time in the 70s where the feminist Christian movement was worshiping Sophia instead of Jesus. Maybe not every feminist on the planet, but there was a movement of people who were worshiping Sophia instead of Jesus. And they weren't necessarily doing it instead of Jesus, but they were flipping the gender. So it wasn't just a male God that they were preaching to. They're saying, well, heck, if in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos is Sophia, then this movement that briefly was in and out was kind of worshiping Sophia for a while. But it's this understanding of the Logos. This Logos was the primordial substance that sparked everything. It was the creative essence from the beginning. All things came from this divine reason. That was Greek philosophy. So John is talking to these Greeks, and John is basically saying, I'm going to put it in different terminology, different language. John is saying to these Greeks, do you know that divine reason that was in the beginning? That divine reason that was the creative essence where all things came from? That divine reason is Jesus. So yes, we can kind of say that the word is Jesus, but he's trying to connect the already established philosophy of the divine reason as being Jesus. He's overlaying Jesus onto that concept. So now when we read it in what the terminology actually means, the phrase says, in the beginning was the divine wisdom, and the divine wisdom was with God, and the divine wisdom was God. So again, going back to this divine knowledge, this divine wisdom, this divine understanding, that's what's at the core of everything. And that's who Jesus is. Jesus is this divine wisdom. We have another gospel that's called the gospel of truth, and we find the logos being talked about throughout the gospel of truth. We have this in a fragmented form, but enough that we know its conversations about the divine wisdom is a central topic in this Christian gospel. You got to flip here. So all of these gospels are the short list. I mean, not the short list. It's not a complete list, but it's probably most of them. This is a list of the gospels that we know of. Okay, these are all Christian gospels. Some of these we know of only because another person referred to it. An early church father may have just mentioned a gospel. Okay, well, there's a gospel. We haven't found it yet through archaeology, but these guys were talking about it, so it must have existed. Some of these other gospels we know in fragmented form. And others of these gospels, we have the complete gospel, and you could buy a copy of this gospel on Amazon or check it out at the local library if your library has it. So these gospels are gospels that we can read. The Bible did not become the Bible till 300 years after Jesus, which means for 300 years, all of these Bibles or all of these gospels were equal in value, if you will, but depending on who you were, because when I say equal in value, your community had one gospel and you followed that one gospel. That was your gospel. That was the gospel. But there was no central authority saying who was right or who was wrong or what had the proper understanding of Jesus or what did not have the proper understanding of Jesus. These were all individual communities living side by side, looking at Jesus radically different. So the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are alongside of these and have no more or less authority than any of these gospels. It just, if you come from the community that has the gospel of Luke, then you do think it has more authority because that's your gospel in your community. But the community who has the gospel of Judas thinks that they have the right interpretation of Jesus. And these gospels all have radically different understandings of who Jesus is. Some see Jesus as both kind of human, kind of divine. Some see Jesus as not being divine at all. The gospel of the Nazarenes, the gospel of the Ebionites, the gospel of the Hebrews down there, they don't see Jesus as being divine at all. Jesus is just a great, great God. He's a great prophet, but he's not a God. There are other ones that say he's only a God and he's not human at all. And you get all kinds of different theological interpretations that drift back and forth between all of these. So for 300 years, all of these understandings of the Bible or of Jesus are on the table. And then when we get the Bible, we're pulling these gospels together. When the Bible was written, it's just collecting different books. It wasn't creating a systematic theology. So we have these 300 years of the Wild West of all of these Christianities bleeding into our Bible. And so in our Bible, we can find Gnosticism in our Bible. I just pointed out the verses. In our Bible, we can find a belief that Jesus was only human and not divine. It's in the Bible. we can find all of these things because it's this hodgepodge of all of these different mini theologies that enter into the Bible. So again, the Gospel of John, I can pull out a lot of Gnostic stuff in the Gospel of John. There's even a lot of Gnostic stuff in the Gospel of Matthew, even though Matthew has a birth narrative, it wants to have the human side of Jesus into it. So we have this, again, this weird mix within the Bible, and it's hard because when we see the Bible, the church has had 2,000 years to make a systematic theology. And depending on which church you walk into, they have a different systematic theology. The Baptists have a very different theology than the Catholics. The United Church of Christ has a very different theology than the Latter-day Saints. You know, that we've all created our different theology. Most of our theology is created outside the Bible. And it's just church tradition that's fed to us as being biblical, but it's not necessarily biblical. It's church tradition because it's what we've made. We pulled strands out of the Bible. We pulled the verses we want out of the Bible to create our theology, and we ignore the other ones. I bet you through your lives, whatever churches all of you have gone to, you've had very few preachers preach on those verses that talked about multiple gods. You know, that there is a God in charge of the earth and a God in charge of the heavens. It's in the Bible. But we just choose not to look at those particular verses. Here we go. Yeah, and then this shows, so even the Gospels that we hold to be our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are Greeks. These are not the disciples, by the way. I don't know if anyone here still thinks that the gospel writers were connected to the disciples, but that's been long debunked, disproved. There are Christians who believe that because that was a belief and we were told to believe it. But even the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attributed to the Gospels later. None of those Gospels in any of the ancient manuscripts have the title, the Gospel of Mark. It's just the Gospel. And then these names were given to the Gospels later. So, and then when they were given to the Gospels, said, "Oh, this is because Matthew wrote this one, or because Mark wrote this one." But it was a later attributed to them. Also, do your mental math. So, like the earliest one is Mark, written in 70 CE. Okay, that would have been roughly 40 years after the death of Jesus. We get to Luke and Matthew, written in 85. So that's what, 55 years after the death of Jesus? Again, depending on when you're dating the death of Jesus. We'll get into that in another lecture. And then the Gospel of John is written in 95. So that's way, way after the death of Jesus. During this time, the average life expectancy was around 40. Okay?
So it's another generation.
That's a whole other generation. And it's a whole other generation of these Gospels written in fluent Greek. The disciples were ignorant fishermen who spoke Aramaic. Okay? So every way you look at it, logically, it's impossible. And we've only scratched the surface of all the ways, you know, scholars would look at it. We're just looking at the obvious stuff. It's written in fluent Greek a generation after, or 2 generations after. These are Greek pagan converts who converted to Christianity, never met Jesus a day in their life because Jesus was long gone after they were done. They heard about Christianity from someone else, and they're all over the map. And when I say all over the map, I mean literally all over the map. So picture in the United States, if I'm going around the United States on a prophet tour and sharing the gospel, and I'm starting a bunch of Brad Jagger churches, and I start one church in downtown Manhattan, and I start another church in a one stoplight town in Kansas, and I teach them the exact same things, those are going to be 2 different churches because the culture is going to be different in each of those places. Now picture throughout the entire Roman Empire, the small little villages Paul preached in, the big Manhattan, New York City type towns he preached in, the different cultures that he was in that had different cultural understandings, different pagan religion practices of their own. They're all kind of absorbing them differently. So we have these different gospels written at different times from different people and written to different people in our Bible. And so even these 4 gospels are 4 different interpretations of who Jesus is. So people say, do they contradict each other? Well, I'm going to say, no, they don't contradict each other, only because that's like saying that Star Wars contradicts Star Trek. They're 2 different movies. You know, these are 2 different books. They weren't meant to go side by side. They were never intended to go side by side. It was 300 years later we put them side by side. They were meant to be an individual gospel to a specific community, and then later we put them side by side. So we have Mark with no birth narrative. We have Luke and Matthew with a birth narrative. We have the Gospel of John starting with this fanciful, in the beginning was the divine wisdom talk, and it having very different theologies throughout. So when we have stuff like an intimate detail of the birth narrative, we have conversations of what people said, what was said by the angel to Mary in private during the Annunciation. How do these pagans know that exact phrase that happened to in a private conversation 2 generations earlier, or at least 1 generation earlier? So we have some questions there. Now, the short Christian answer was, well, God gave them the information. Well, you can never argue with that logic. But that would be the Christian answer to it. Well, God gave them the information. Well, God gave them different information because they all wrote different stories. And we'll talk about that more next week, is the differences in the story. But they wrote different stories because they were writing for different reasons. They were writing for a different audience, trying to present a different theology. Again, the Gospel of Mark, I just told you about, has no birth narrative. Surprisingly, a lot of people are surprised to find this out, but the Gospel of Mark has no resurrection scene. Pull out your Bible and get to the very end of the resurrection scene. And in your Bible, because I think almost all Bibles, I think even the King James Bible does this, I think all the Bibles has it in parentheses and saying, yeah, it wasn't really there. We made it up later. It's in parentheses. And the Gospel of Mark ends with, they ran to the empty tomb. They saw that it was empty, and they ran away, for they were afraid. The last word in the Gospel of Mark is afraid. Everything that comes after that is an addition that was added much later. And it was added much later because they didn't want it to end that way. And your Bible, again, I think most all Bibles do this. They put it in parentheses and come up front with you and say, this was added later. What's interesting is one of the things that was added in that later part was the whole handling of snakes. You know, if you have enough faith, you'll handle the snakes and they won't bite you. So all those churches out there with members dying because they're handling snakes in Appalachia are doing it off of a part of the Bible that was never in the original Bible. It was a later edition line that was in there. But that's the Gospel of Mark. But the Gospel of Mark wasn't concerned about the birth narrative or resurrection. This isn't even to speak to whether either of these things happened or did not happen. Mark was not concerned about it. He had a different agenda with a different message, and he conveyed a message that he wanted to convey. Let's see here. Yeah, just talking about the Gospel of John itself has no birth narrative, and we can find some Gnostic elements in the Gospel of John, again, with this divine wisdom. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, here's the dating of each of the Gospels, showing the birth narrative and the resurrection scene, who has them, who does not have them. Next Sunday, or next Tuesday, we're going to get into specifically talking about Matthew and Luke, and we're going to get into the birth narrative and look at, probably not quite line by line, but we're going to look at it at a very macro or a micro level, looking at what was Matthew's birth narrative and what was Luke's birth narrative. If we want to go home and read them for homework between now and then, they're different birth narratives with different messages. And one could say that they contradict each other, but they only contradict each other because Matthew didn't know Luke was writing a birth narrative. Luke didn't know Matthew was writing a birth narrative. And both of these Greeks, a generation later, sat down to write about an event that happened 85 years earlier, and no one else had ever sat down to write about it. Picture if we were supposed to write something down that happened 85 years ago, and no one else in history ever wrote any word about it. And we now, and even make it harder, it's not even our story. So something that happened in China that happened in a different culture and a different language, and no one ever wrote about it. And we're going to now write a story about what happened in China 85 years ago, and we're the first ones to ever write about it. And so I'm writing a version of it, and someone else is writing a version of it. And Matthew and Luke's versions are very different because they had different theological agendas that they were trying to address. And that's why Mark doesn't have a birth narrative, because he wasn't concerned about the birth narrative. He had a different agenda, and John has a very different agenda. So you have 4 very different gospels throughout. So now that is pretty much my earth-shattering information on Gnosticism in the 4 gospels and setting the foundation for how we understand this. Now, I'm sure someone out there must have a question of some kind. Who has a question? I'll stop sharing my screen here too.
I have an
Ask your-
observation.
What's your observation?
If, Matthew and Mark, who wrote about the birth narrative, had to have a
Matthew and
hint.
Luke.
I'm sorry, Matthew and Luke
Yeah.
had to have a hint that there was a birth of some kind. I mean, virgin birth, again, a lot of religions had the virgin birth component in it as part of it at the time. So was this a pure fabrication or a hint from somewhere that, because one person putting together a story is one thing. 2 people putting together a similar story, not fully similar, but a similar story, putting together a birth narrative per se. I mean, that's more than a coincidence, I think.
Yeah.
How do you
yeah.
explain that?
Yeah, well, certainly I think Jesus was born,
Right. Yeah.
But the Gnostics didn't believe that. So that's why they had to write the story. So there were some people who did not believe that. Mary, the mother of Jesus, did live a long, healthy life because she's talked about after Jesus died. So she outlived her son, and her son was meant to be around 30 when he died. We'll talk about that timing later too. So we do know that there was a woman named Mary. And she's talked about, there's evidence of her existence. We have a lot of information about James, the brother of Jesus, and not half brother, not step brother, not, brother from another mother. He is his brother. And we have tons of information about James. And so if we have tons of information about James, the brother of Jesus, that's also evidence that Jesus was a person who was born. So we do have this evidence out there, but it's like any historical fiction, so I know that's a controversial thing to say when I'm talking about the birth of Jesus, but in any historical fiction, it is historical. So you do have historical facts in there. But the story of Jack and Rose just simply did not happen on the Titanic. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. But the Titanic did happen. And a lot of stuff in that movie was historically accurate. There's stuff we know in the birth narrative that again, we'll learn next week. I don't want to jump the gun too much. There's stuff in the birth narrative that in no way, shape, or form matches history. We have extensive history documents, and we have the birth narratives, and the two don't match up. So there are stuff that's fabricated. It's either fabricated completely as I'm going to make this up, or it's fabricated because it's a Greek writing 85 years after the event when no one else wrote about it, and all you have is hearsay, and then you're filling it in to make it into a good story. And so he's getting his facts wrong. But there are just things that don't match historic facts. But yeah, was he born? There are scholars out there, by the way, there are books out there trying to prove that Jesus never existed. So that thought, even in 2023, is out there that he never existed. For me, he did exist, but he did exist for me, not because we have historical evidence of Jesus, but we have some historical evidence of his family members. You have to understand, we have zero historical evidence of Jesus. Jesus never wrote anything. The first person to write anything about Jesus was Paul, the Apostle Paul, who never met Jesus a day in his life, who lived in the Greek world, was born and raised in the Greek world. That's the first way I've written about Jesus anywhere. We don't have his birth certificate. We don't have his driver's license. We don't have anything etched on anything that says Jesus. And so any information we have about the existence of Jesus comes from secondary sources. Again, we have a lot of information about his brother, James. We have information about his mother. There was a great following that came from somewhere. The great following didn't come from just nothing, but we have to understand that those are all secondary, thirdary, fourthary, whatever, sources that we have. We have zero primary sources on Jesus. And that's why some of the scholars try to write, and I say they're a very minority, but there's enough evidence out there for a scholar to write a book that Jesus didn't exist, if that makes sense. That's not saying he didn't make sense, but we're pulling our information from secondary and tertiary sources. That's not a very secure thing. And the most primary source we have is Paul, who never met Jesus. This is for a whole other class another day, not in the Christmas season. But Peter is the rock that Jesus was going to build his church on. I think we all know that. Do we know that part of the Bible? Peter was the rock that Jesus was going to put. Peter gets two letters tucked in the back of the Bible that amount to probably a total of 3 pages between the two letters, depending on your Bible's print. That's all Peter gets. James is the brother of Jesus. James is the brother of Jesus who led the disciples after Jesus died. James gets one letter that is like a leaflet, 1 page front and back, tucked in the back of the Bible. Jude, another brother of Jesus, gets one little leaflet tucked in the back of the Bible. And all 3 of these are tucked in the back of the Bible together. And Paul, who never met Jesus a day in his life, influences most of the rest of the New Testament. Most of the letters are of Paul. Most of the letters are Paul's followers. And most of the Gospels that were chosen because they align with Paul's core theology. And not that everything's 100% Paul, but it's at least within a framework of Paul. And it's a whole other class for us to talk about. Why did Peter, the rock upon which the church would be built, get shafted in his contribution to the Bible? And by the way, that letter wasn't even written by Peter. It was written by a later follower of Peter, way late. Why did Jude get shafted and shoved in the back? Why did James, the brother, the leader of the early church movement, get shafted in the back. There are reasons for that, but that's a whole other can of worms to open up. And so we have their theology. Here's the short answer. We have their theology that differs from Paul's theology. And Paul's theology won out. Why did Paul's theology win out? Well, he's spreading the word in the Greek world. Paul was born and raised in the Greek world. He could speak their language. He could do things like John was doing. He could speak their language. Oh, you know that divine wisdom? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Jesus. And so Paul is able to connect with that message and convey that message in a way that they understand, where these very Jewish Aramaic-speaking fishermen couldn't do the same. Their message still survived, but that's a whole other can of worms. But that's also to show that the Bible is going to have different theologies. If you're reading those three family members of Jesus, or Peter's not really a family member, but those three core people in the back, and you read Paul, you're going to read different theologies. Even when you read like Timothy is understood to be a letter of Paul. Timothy is not a letter of Paul. It says it's a letter of Paul, but it's what's known as a forgery. There are several forged letters to Paul. We know that it was much later. It's like any English teacher reading two students' papers, and you're like, well, you have two different words, or two different languages. Two different students speak the different ways. So linguists can look at those two letters and see language-wise that it's written by a different voice. But also theologically, it's different. So one example would be Paul says it's best if you never get married. Timothy is saying you need to get married. It's a must. You need to get married. You need to have a family. Well, that's two very different letters. In fact, Timothy is yelling at people who are telling people not to get married. Don't listen to those heathens who are telling you not to get married. They're leading you astray. Well, that can't be Paul. Well, the other one's also Paul. It doesn't make sense. It's Timothy's got a different theology from Paul. Paul's got a different theology from James. Yet they're all in the Bible together. And so what I often say too is, when I say we, I'm using a collective we here. We often say, all of us are guilty of it, that church down the road is picking the verses they want to do, and they're fabricating a false theology. We're not doing anything any different. Their theology is solid from the Bible, based on the scriptures they chose to hold near and dear to their hearts. We at Windermere Union Church in the United Church of Christ have chosen our verses, and we created our theology, and we say our theology is right, and we've ignored the other lines that are in the Bible that we don't agree with. For instance, we ignored the line about two gods in the Bible, one God controlling. Some churches put that up front and center. Some of you probably attended those churches, that the devil is in control of the earth and the devil is in control of us. And, that's straight from the Bible. They're not making this up. That's in the Bible. But it's in the Bible in selected areas. And other areas would contradict that kind of thinking. So all this to say, yeah, I think the birth narrative happened, but it was written for a reason. And based on their limited knowledge, without Wikipedia to go to for answers, the knowledge is sketchy. And the number one reason why the birth narrative, or anything in the Bible for that matter, was written was not to write a historical account. The reason it was written was to write a theological document. That's very different. So they were trying to convey a theology. The historical accuracy was not at the forefront of what they wanted to say. And it's not that they were trying to necessarily forge the history. They weren't concerned about the history. They were concerned about the theology. So that's where you get these different views.
Thank you, Brad. That was very informative. I really enjoyed it a lot.
Mhm.
And next week, we talked around it at the end here, but next week, we're going to get into Matthew and Luke. And if you guys want to do your homework and read the birth narrative and everything around before and after the birth narrative of Matthew and Luke, we'll slice and dice it, because maybe some stuff you don't see right off the bat, but there are things in the birth narrative. I'm going to jump the gun real quick. I'm going to give you one teaser for next week, because I can't help myself. So here's the teaser next week. We all know that Matthew, I think we all know this, Matthew says that King Herod was trying to kill Jesus as a baby. Okay? So that's core to Matthew's theology. King Herod was trying to kill Jesus as a baby. Luke says that Jesus was born while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Do we know that line? If you don't know the line, watch the Peanuts cartoon, and Linus on stage reads that passage. So Jesus was born while Quirinius was governor of Syria. The problem is Herod being a king, we have loads of historical documents about King Herod. Quirinius being a governor of Syria, we have loads of information about Quirinius. Remember, no one wrote anything about Jesus till 20 years after he died. But we have loads of information about these two figures. What we do know is King Herod died in 4 BCE. What we do know is Quirinius became governor of Syria in 6 CE. How was Jesus born both 4 BCE and 6 CE? It's a logical impossibility. So either one of the two are wrong, or both of them are wrong. But one thing we do know is right: the whole BC AD calendar is a mistake.
Hi, buddy.
That's one of the reasons why we use BCE and CE now, before the Common Era and after the Common Era, because it doesn't make sense to use the terminology basing it on Jesus, because I think most all scholars, including most conservative scholars, understand that the monk who made that calendar hundreds of years after Jesus wasn't the best historian in the world. But we do have that's just one little nugget from next week that we'll pull out. We have historical facts on Herod. We have historical facts on Quirinius. They are what they are. And now we have these stories and what happened. And again, the point is, they weren't trying to write history. They were trying to write a theological narrative. And so, yeah, I think Quirinius is around that time, and he's pulling that out as part of a story, but he's not sitting down in a methodical way trying to plot out what the historical events actually were. He has an agenda. Matthew has an agenda. And we'll talk about Matthew's agenda. We'll talk about Luke's agenda and why the stories developed the way they did. And we'll go through step by step. But there's your teaser. So your minds can be blown. You guys can go cry tonight and have another Zoom chat after I get off and then curse my name. But these are the facts, and I'm sticking to them. And if you think this is difficult, you guys are all open-minded, loving people, whether you like what I had to say or not like what I had to say. Imagine all of the 18 and 19-year-old born-again Christians who take my class and have to sit there because it's a requirement.
Oh.
When I used to teach face-to-face, we had some really fun conversations. So,
I'm gonna go
with
turn
that-
some water into wine.
yeah, I can do that. All right, it was a great talking with you. If anyone has any other
Thank
questions
you.
throughout the week, email me, talk to me, give me a phone call. I'd be happy to talk beyond tonight with anyone. So with that,
Okay.
talk to you later.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night, guys.
Bye.
Good night.